Hi there. So today what I'm going to be covering is the second part in our video, our lecture series on modern world history. If you'll remember last time, we took some time looking at the Popple Bills. We took some time just reviewing some of the history around colonization and its impacts after the age of exploitation discovery took off, and how we become familiar, how to become familiar with what really established what today and in popular culture we think about when we talk about modern world history. So today is going to be kind of jumping back into this discussion and starting to review some of the main ideas that I'm hoping to leave you with in this module and topic that we're covering, right? For me, the goal has been to provide my students with an understanding that there is a reason why some of the structures are in place today, some of the tensions around some of these global powers exist today, and really why we are dealing with such oppression in regards to Indigenous peoples. As we start to see, there very much was a focused event that was triggered after the Popple Bills, which really initiated what today we're looking around us and talk about this global crisis, and specifically around environmental exploitation and the impacts that it has had specifically, again, around climate change. These are all kind of focusing on your projects, this discussion. I want you to continue to reflect on these concepts I'm sharing with you. Take them into your research. Provide us with a learning experience in your presentations that help us to really grapple with some of these hard questions and hard topics that people have such a difficult time dealing with today. So let's get into the lecture. As you'll see here, this is the lecture series we're going to start with. All right. Now, this is taken from another reading that we're going to be looking at the end of the term. However, it does provide a 4-stage process of the colonial conquest that occurred, the project of colonialism, the global colonial project, let's call it. And it's taken from chapter 9, page 278 of a reading that you're going to be covering in the last week or so of lectures. All right. And this is what it says, that there's 4 stages. You can, if you Google the stages of colonial conquest, colonization, you're going to see that they all come up. Sometimes there's 5 stages, sometimes there's 6 stages. So they all kind of, but if you kind of look at it, they kind of all work into the same piece. So first, there's exploration along the frontiers. So when we get into Indigenous peoples within Canada, your textbook, your course textbook in a week or so, you're going to see that that was the first stage. They come along the shores of the Atlantic. They come into contact with the Indigenous peoples along the coastline, and then it begins to proceed. On the other coast, it was much later, 200 years later, whether it was coming from down along the southern tip of what's today called South America and coming along the coastline and coming into what's today called British Columbia, you have that same stage as well, exploration along frontiers. So that's stage 1. Stage 2, trade and Christian missionary activity. Everywhere around the globe, because of those Popple Bills, this was the justification. So not only were they establishing trade, looking for the exploitable resources, they were also very much these explorers looking, these Christian explorers, they are also looking for an opportunity to spread the word of Christ. I've read the Bible 3 times. They didn't spread the word of Christ very well in many of these areas. That was just, it's terrible. It's really terrible. I've studied the Quran, I've studied the Bible, and it's yeah, it's just not quite what I think would have been intended had it been done differently. So anyway, then there's European settlement. So you have exploration, trade and missionary activity. Then you have European settlement, and you're going to see that by the time we get to chapters 5, 6, and 7 of your textbook and into chapter 9 and 10, you start to see the last stage, administrative control. For example, the Indian Act here in Canada, which to this very day in 2020, a 150-year-old legislation still controls the lives of all of the Indigenous peoples that are defined as an Indian under the Indian Act, our lives. So let's start with that. So we talked about this doctrine with these papal bills that were issued, right? They legitimize this claiming of non-Christian lands for Christendom. And we went through this, so this is just a review slide if you'd watched part 1 of the series. And it really begins this process of the legitimization of this exploited period of time that continues to this very day. Without the doctrine of discovery, no colonial state, whether it's Canada, the United States of America, New Zealand, Australia, none of these huge states that have claimed a significant area of the landmass of Earth, Mother Earth, whatever you want to say, not everybody calls her Mother Earth, even among the indigenous people of the world. Okay, you need to know that. They wouldn't have any claim of it if it was because of those 2 papal bills. When we go back even into the legislations and the law systems that were in place, they all can be traced back to this. So again, this is a review slide. As a review, you can see all these different colonial powers, how they went out around the world, and how they were able to really claim much of the entire world's continents in the name of Christ using these papal bills, right? Again, another review slide. This is what was traded. Please take time to review it. At one time, I did ask a question specifically around Spain. I asked the question on the midterm. What was traded from the English colonies to Spain after it became an established colony? Or something like that, I said. And the right response I was looking for was grain, rum, fish, and lumber. Because I wanted to see that people were really getting this, that lumber is a huge thing. It baffles me that we talk about all these other things that were taken, but this whole area of North America was a massive forest. By this time, Europe had already decimated her forest due to the excessive exploitation that was occurring there. And there was very little forest left intact. So by the time we get to the exploitation era of North America, you begin to see timber, you begin to see, to me it's like, we never talk about it, but yet it was so significant. And this video here is going to really focus in this lecture on this thing here, slaves, and this one here, slaves. Right? So the colonial economic system, again, another review slide, empire on top. So whether it is the British Empire, whether it's whatever, today this empire exists today. It's global. That's a global empire right now. That is really a mixture of nation states and huge multinational companies. That's empire today. So they go in these multinational companies, or whether it's nation states, they go into these areas and they begin the process of exploitation of the peoples and the land. And from that, they're able to draw in food resources, wealth, and taxes into the empire itself. And this conquest is able to make this system work. And it's still happening today. Whether we go to South America, continental Africa, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, this exploitation is still occurring for the benefit of empire. These are some good clicks here if you want to just kind of look at when we talk about the slave trade, this transatlantic slave trade. It was incredibly intense for a period of time. And from that, we can definitely see that there is a significant implication for the human lives in continental Africa. So these are for your reference. Colonization of Africa. Well, I'm not sure if you're aware of it, but there is this event that is the Berlin Conference that started on November 15th, 1884. So this would have been here around the time of the Métis resistance, right? And it continued on to February 26th of the following year. By its end, European powers had divided up continental Africa amongst themselves, drawing the boundaries of Africa, much as we know them today. So when you look at the continent of Africa and all its states and areas, this was really what was defined in that 2-3 month event. Now, most people think that the significant amount of slaves, enslaved human beings, came to the 13 colonies and went into these cotton plantations here. But that's not exactly correct. If you look at the figures here, and by the way, I have a friend that spent a considerable amount of time in resisting what's happening in Africa in the 80s and 90s and came back. He will tell you that the numbers here are grossly underrepresented, that there is probably closer to 100 million enslaved human beings that found their way in ships and died either in progress or on the plantations or managed to survive. So as you can see, the greater majority of them actually went into areas such as Brazil. By this time, all of the indigenous populations were exterminated or there was few left. So when you travel to these areas now, the population is primarily a mixture of Spanish blood and continental enslaved human being descendants. And that is, unless you go into the interior on this side, you'll find more that cultures that are still intact. There's still some along the Amazon in here as well. But yeah, it's like the Amazon runs in here somewhere. So your research project, find those numbers out. So this is what kind of evolved an agricultural slavery economy. You have government that legalized, literally, slavery. It was legal to be a slave owner and to have slaves. And, there was an ideology, the religion, it justified slavery. And we're going to look at a slide that talks about that one, the Christian foundation of it, as well as an economy. Agriculture, of course, it depended on slavery. Without the slaves, there would have been no economy. So this is the system that was established during this period of discovery exploitation. So this is the religious justification for slavery. Noah cursed Ham's son. Cursed be Canaan. The lowest of slaves will he be to his brothers. He also said, blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem. May Canaan be the slave of Shem. May God extend the territory of Japheth, and may Japheth live in the tents of Shem, and may Canaan be his slave. Genesis chapter 9, verses 25 to 27. So it is believed that the descendants of Ham inhabited continental Africa. So this, at the time, was used to justify African slavery as it took off in the period that we're going to be talking about here in this lecture. So this agricultural slavery economy, this is how it really looks in terms of a picture. You have the owners of the slaves on top, you have the slave population below, and really, when you really think about it, this is very representative of the Canadian society today. And then some of you are going to be offended by that. But we have the owners or the bosses on top. We have the slave population that provides food production and labor and taxes, and it feeds into the system. this is what was established and has been entrenched in the psyche of the populations that came here and share the lands with the land's first original peoples. This is how it was established, through slavery. So the Industrial Revolution, I don't know, I'm just going to push back here. It seems like this is cutting off in a way that I don't even know if you guys are seeing a lot of this. Oh, sorry, that I should have had up there. Apologize for that. I hope you're following on your own slides, all right? So the Industrial Revolution then, from 1733 to 1913, that's quite a chunk of time, all right, began in Britain, and by the 1830s and 40s had spread to the rest of the world. It was fueled by steam power. And why was it able to happen there? Well, because Great Britain at that time had this incredible resource base, if you want to use those terms, of coal. And as a consequence of that, when all these new developments, these new inventions came in to the mix, because they had already mastered using mining metals, steel, to make metal things, steel machines, you know, and so that you begin to see this process taking off during the period of the Industrial Revolution. So European countries, there was an incredible amount of competition among them. Each expanded trade without regulation during this period. They all needed raw materials, and where did they get them from? Well, the colonies, of course, right? Primarily in some of the ones that were actually the ones that were generating this or feeding this monster as it was being created, required iron and coal to do that. Expanding was also a period when individual liberties, by this time you had had exposure to the works of Cadwallader Colden. People were recognizing that personal liberty was an important part of being a human being, that they didn't have to be subservient to a monarch and the whims of one. So you begin, this is also the period when you see that period of revolutions take off. So you have a lot of these things kind of happening during the same time. Technologies, power, coal, water. You start to see optics being able to look into things, machinery, weapons, guns, cannons were starting to get fine-tuned. And in the Far East, they were already working on these way ahead of that period and had already mastered a lot of the skills required to make type of cannons, throwing rocks at the beginning, and the other, like that's just, if you study history, it's quite fascinating. It's depressing, but it is fascinating. So England, they were producing goods for the masses, and if we were to go back to that screen where all this trading was going on, there's another slide coming up that'll show that Great Britain was ideally suited, because of their easy access to the oceans, to transport goods to the colonies here in North America and also to continental Africa, but also in ships to go to the Far East. And there was also these overland routes, right? But primarily it was the sea routes that made it possible. So that's why when they took over India, what's today called India, that they were getting raw goods from there, they were shipping them back into Great Britain, turning them into manufactured goods, selling them back to India, and they were doing the same thing to all the other colonies as well. So that's how they were able to increase their wealth and power during this period. It also spawned, though, the abuse of labor. Women, children, they were chained at times to machines. You had children, and you probably heard, going into the coal mines, the small kids, and they were paid a pittance. And they would die a horrible death, a lot of them, when the poison in the mines would erupt. That's why canary in the coal mine, right? They all had this little bird trapped in a cage, and when the canary fell over, well, everybody got the heck out of the mine, because you only had this minute or two if you wanted to live, or you would die from the gases that were starting to be released. So the rich became richer during this period, dominated the world in terms of wealth. And you have key people, old wealth arising from the exploitation, particularly of North America, that found its birth in what's today called Europe, and including Great Britain. When we talk about old wealth today, I want you to be mindful. A lot of that old wealth came from the exploitation of human beings and land and the environment in other parts of the world during this period. So from this, you begin to see inequity start to the point now where they used to say 1% of the people had this. Like, actually, it's now down to way less than 1%. There's like, 35, 40 people in the world that have more wealth than the bottom half of the rest of humanity. And I think I'm being generous in that. I don't have the paper in front of me, but my 201, we look at that very carefully. So from the inequity that took off, the response in Europe was this idea of socialism, and communism took off. I want you to be very clear on something. What we had here pre-contact was not socialism or communism. Socialism and communism was a response to capitalism and the Industrial Revolution's exploitive nature on human beings during the period. So, but it did lead to an incredible amount of inequity. And so this is a great pic I like to always show you. Great Britain, at one time, they said that the sun never set on the British Empire. That's how big it grew during this period, as it began to expand with it to India, North America, just great, New Zealand, Australia, before they all became their own states. This is how England established itself in that period. It had, Ireland was even taken over. Yeah, it's Gibraltar. Anyway, that's what happened. And here's another pic of it. At its peak, it controlled 1/6 of humanity. And this is what Mark Twain had to say. All the territorial possessions of all the political establishments in the earth, including America, of course, consist of pilferings from other people's wash. No tribe, however insignificant, and no nation, howsoever mighty, occupies a foot of land that was not stolen. Mark Twain. And from this, you get this age of imperialism then, right? From this, it kind of is a process. Diffusion of wealth occurred from Britain to its colonies. You have the USA, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, part of that. From Northern Europe to Southern Europe, railroads were being built, serfdom ended, industry financed by capital. Very much you see this, the stock markets really taking shape, being birthed and taking shape and crystallized to what we have in today. As we looked at in Indigenous contributions and perspectives, this period of time really did lend itself to the age of imperialism that began to establish itself afterward. So from Europe to the world, Latin America, Asia, and Africa, you begin to see imperialism, these stronghold powers begin to establish their mark. European wealth equals power. Exploitation of the Americas, Africa, Asia, forced Africans to grow cash crops, forced indigenous peoples to work in mines and in plantations. Natural resources taken back to the motherland, turned into finished goods. Private colonial armies, police ensured compliance. They brought them in, and they're doing that today too. They still are doing this. It's still the same thing. When there's any kind of a resistance to the imperialism that exists even today, you still see the military being brought in to subdue the natives. It's still the same. It hasn't changed. The weapons are just deadlier. So this is the imperialist expansion that begins to take place. Okay, you have government driven by military domination, ideology, again, religious and cultural justification that it's okay to do this, and economics, the economy, domination of resources and markets. How many millions of dollars, if not billions, is the Canadian government right now during COVID holding up the fossil fuel industry when it could be focused on clean energy? Now that's controversial, but there's still, again, an ideological justification for the domination of resources and markets today that are driving the expansion that is still occurring, even to this day. The mentality hasn't changed that much. World War I, if you start to look at these were all colonial powers. When we talk about World War I and World War II, all they were was colonial imperialist powers fighting for global control of lands that were stolen. They all wanted to control the world, whether it was Germany, Russia, France, England, the United States, or the Ottoman Empire. This is what World War I really was. That's why many peoples, they refused to take part in it, because they didn't see it as their war. On a fundamental level and on an ideological level, they didn't see the insanity, being a part of the insanity that was unfolding. And World War II, well, it was a reaction to World War I. You have many of the same players, some new ones coming in, and they're all colonial powers. All of these are colonizers. All of them. All of them had built up an incredible military strength using their resource exploitation of coal and of iron to be able to build weapons that would compete with each other for world domination. Call it what you will. Some people say they were just trying to keep the real bad guys in place, but when it comes down to it, from the perspective of original peoples inhabiting these areas that were being impacted by this fight, this war, they were all part of the same mindset that was unfolding during this period. And of course, the Cold War, that was a reaction to World War II. First world, there's Western Europe and allies. Second world, Russia, China, and allies. Third world, former colonies of Africa, Asia, and the Americas. So keep that in mind. I don't think that's ever taught in any class. So as a consequence of this, we have today this incredible inequity around the world. These attempts for global domination of these imperialist powers over the last 100 years or so, 120 now, I guess, have really established what was already being established from the Industrial Revolution, what was already being established from the inequity that took off after the Popple Bills were issued. You can't have any group of people with an incredible amount of power and authority without seeing the abuse of it if it's unchecked. If there isn't systems in place to keep it in check, then the peoples at the bottom, in this case, looking at this one, what's today called First World. Well, the First World countries are all the ones that took the cream off the top. They're all the colonial powers of the world that were the first colonizers from Europe. And some also include from the Far East, because they were doing their own colonization during this period as well. But we're not looking at that too much in this course, because these lectures I've been giving you are preparing you to jump into our textbook and how colonization begins to evolve here in what's today called Canada. So look at this. All the third world countries that are considered third world, they're the ones that were most exploited since 1492. And they have become so dependent on the first world countries that a lot of, to this day, the food and resources that they can generate are still being fed into the first world. And the first world is still extracting a lot of the wealth from these areas, fossil fuels, diamonds, any resource that's worth anything is being extracted by these huge multinational companies and the nation states. And they're using force in many cases to continue the process. And it has established world poverty inequity. If you were to take a look at this here, you would see that hunger today, it didn't have to occur. It is really a consequence of our history. Colonialism, economic domination, and repressive governments have had a huge impact on world hunger today. And if you were to open up this and start to take a look at some of the charts, what you would see is how some areas of the world today are living, the people are so impoverished as a consequence of our history globally. And that, I think, is what I really want to drive home in this module and topic with these two lectures. That at some point we begin to see. And at that point, when our eyes start to be opened and we start to recognize what's really going on around us, then we begin to understand. And when we begin to understand, because with knowledge comes understanding, comes action. See, this is, as a teacher, this is what you really want to do. You want to transform your students. You want them to leave your course differently in a good way than when they entered into the course. And that's something that I hope that you got something from. At least start to have some further understanding about why the world is the way it is today. What were some of those events that kind of triggered it? Maybe not why it is the way it is, but what happened to kind of get us here. So just in closing, here are some links. I encourage you to take a look at some of them. Some of these are really good. This one is looking at liberation. I think I talked to you in previous lectures. I also drew your attention to it in this one about the idea that this structure, this construct where there's, whether it's a monarch or a president or a prime minister, or it's concentrated atop the power. And we've looked at that in our module on leadership and governance. And you have people below. Then what this one does is looking at it from a current. It's written by an incredible individual in 2016, talking about getting out of this mindset that was brought here, the slave culture that is okay with being down here. And how are the Haudenosaunee, how are they going to achieve humanhood again? This is what that is talking about in the language. So it's good stuff. So I hope it takes time to look at. These other ones are kind of like none of these are going to be tested. You're not tested on any of these. Again, I'll remind you, anything that I provide you as links on your PowerPoints, unless I clearly tell you it is exam material for your midterm or your final, you are not responsible for it. This is for extra research on your own, no credit, just you want to look at things more. That's what I give you these links for, okay? Okay, and with that, I think we're at the end of this lecture. So I'm hoping next lecture we are going to get into looking at, oh geez, where is my schedule of lectures? I don't have it handy here. Oh, I usually have everything handy. Let me just see it. I know I have it here. Poop. Oh, poop. Okay, anyway, we need to get into the next piece of our, do I have it? Let me just check. Nope, I don't have a scheduled lecture, so that's okay. Okay, so the next one I do believe we're jumping into, whoa, I better bring it up for you guys. Sorry about this. I just might as well do it. Because, no, myself ahead in front of me. So we've gone through this, all right? So here we're at. Gone through that, gone through that, gone through that. And so, how the conquest of Indigenous peoples parallels the conquest of nature. That's right. So please pull out that reading. I sent you all out a link, I believe. If you need the link, just Google it. If this doesn't open for you, just Google it. Google how it's such a famous lecture. You'll find it, no problem, on the internet. All right, so that's the next one. So with that, I'm going to say fare thee well and watch this video, stay up with your study notes, make sure that you're working on the proposal, got some questions in regards to the proposal. Please watch the course assessment video before you send me messages on how to make it, how to form it, what does it look like. I also shared some links on the course outline. I know some of you are not happy with your quiz marks. Please talk to your TA if you have one. If you don't, I think both sections I'm going to share this video with. You both have Carissa for your TA. Contact Carissa, and if it doesn't resolve itself, then contact me. All right? Okay. So with that, have a great weekend, and I'll see you guys Monday.